Hi, my name is Drew Levanti, and welcome to Elections Weekly, a show where I take you on a tour of the week ahead through the lens of electional astrology. Today, we'll be looking at the elections for the week of January 11th, 2022. Remember to like and comment on the video and subscribe to my channel for future content on electional astrology and beyond. Before getting into the elections, I want to make you aware of the Bronx Fire Relief Fund, which will help support people affected by the tragic fire that happened yesterday in the Bronx. Check out the link in the video description for a place where you can help. So now let's get into the elections for the week. Our first chart is for Tuesday, January 11th. This chart has 12 degrees of Cancer rising, and it happens roughly around 3:50 p.m. in whatever your location is. I have this chart set for Chicago, which is where I live, but it will look only slightly different if you put in 3:50 p.m. in your location. On January 11th, the moon is in Taurus, and it's in a trine with Venus retrograde. So the moon in electional astrology is incredibly important. The moon is the closest body to us, and so its movements not only vary the most, so it gives us the most ability to change our elections or choose charts on the basis of what the moon's doing, but also the moon is that body which has the most to do with the sort of ebb and flow of life on Earth. So the moon in Taurus is usually a very positive place to have the moon for most elections. With the moon being in Taurus when Venus is retrograde, this is important because Venus is the ruler of Taurus. So while the moon in Taurus is incredibly strong in this election, also being in the 11th house, ruling the ascendant, there's a lot in this chart about gain and audience and taking a leap forward in terms of solidifying and accumulating gains that have been made in community. So perhaps you're gaining more influence, or you're starting to take on a larger voice, or your voice is getting further. The 11th house is about that social sphere. And so the moon being exalted in this place is making connections. That's what the moon does, right? It reflects, it receives. And so this placement of the moon is on its face incredibly powerful for making strides in community and making strides in your network of people, your audience, and things like that. But with Venus being retrograde, this might show that the long-term impact of this action kind of fizzles out, that there is this immediate force, this immediate success due to the moon being exalted, but because the ruler of the moon is somewhat debilitated, being retrograde and also combust, this means that at the end of the day, or rather at the end of maybe a year or a couple of years, that this action will have had initial successes, but those successes fizzle out after a little bit. In this chart, we also see Mercury conjunct Saturn, and this is something that all of the elections for this week are going to have. Mercury is slowing down to its station before it turns retrograde. And Mercury retrogrades, elections often have Mercury retrograde. And so in this chart, with Mercury being conjunct Saturn in the 8th house, this makes me think a lot about intellectual resources, particularly intellectual resources that are shared. So oftentimes we think, I have an idea, but our ideas, anything new that we create, is always situated within the context of existing ideas. Nothing is ever truly new. It always emerges from things that have existed before. And those ideas that we may have are always built on the backs of other ideas. And so with Mercury being conjunct Saturn in the 8th house of other people's resources, we're dealing with information, ideas, and messages that are in some way indebted to others. And so, for example, in this video, I'm talking about electional astrology, and I'm talking about what I could call my approach to electional astrology. But of course, I have many teachers, and there are many people who have influenced my practice. And there are many people who continue to influence my practice in small, subtle ways, and some people in bigger ways. just by absorbing information on like social media, for example, just by having certain words, certain messages circulating in my brain or my mind or my being, we could say that I'm always being influenced by others. And so that's what this Mercury conjunct Saturn makes me think of, because it's in this place that has to do with other people's resources. It has to do with information that you're borrowing or ways that your knowledge has been informed by others. This is a really excellent chart for ninth house matters because we have Jupiter in the ninth house in its own sign. So ninth house matters include prediction, forecasting, astrology, tarot, prediction of any kind, really, even economic forecasting or making predictions in general. So if you're somebody who, for example, plays the stock market, I'm not recommending that anybody do any particular thing with their money, but if you're somebody who, for example, shares information about the stock market, this would be a really good chart for you to put out some information, or anything else where there's a predictive element. You're saying what's going to happen. With Jupiter being in the ninth house, it's also a really supportive chart for seeking counsel, getting advice from people, because that is also a ninth house topic. So if you need to seek out a lawyer, for example, or you're interested in getting somebody's advice on anything that you're doing in your life, this would be a really nice chart for that, especially given the fact of that Mercury-Saturn conjunction in the eighth house. We're talking about other people's knowledge, right? So this kind of eighth house, ninth house activity speaks to getting advice or getting feedback, input from others. Our second chart is also going to be Cancer rising, and it's for January 12th. So basically just one day later, approximately 24 hours later, we're going to be looking at basically the same chart. And the only things that have changed are that the moon has moved a little bit further forward. Mercury has gotten a little bit closer to its station and to its retrograde. And we're basically looking at the same chart. The difference here in terms of, interpretive differences is that this election focuses a lot more on Jupiter. And why that is the case might at first be a little bit unclear, because in both charts, Jupiter is in the ninth house. In both charts, Jupiter is in Pisces. It's hardly moved at all because Jupiter is slow. But there are subtle ways in which this election emphasizes Jupiter more. So what are those? First of all, this election is in the hour of Jupiter. So planetary hours are often used in magic, but I also use them in my electional practice because I think that they're really important, and I think that it gives us a lot of interesting ways to make meaning in our charts. If you want to learn more about planetary hours, check out another link in the video description, which will be to a video that I did about planetary hours and defining the principle, and also some ways that I like to use them in elections. So with Jupiter being the ruler of the hour, Jupiter's presence in Pisces is magnified. And it is a magnanimous presence in Pisces, right? Jupiter is giving and supportive. And so we can really draw on the strength of Jupiter, the beneficence of Jupiter, to help us with this election. It's still a strong 11th house election. The ruler of the ascendant is in the 11th sign. Taurus is 11th from Cancer, and so that brings the 11th house to the forefront. And the 11th house is also the joy of Jupiter. It's its planetary joy, which if you don't know about, just Google planetary joys, Chris Brennan, and you'll find a paper that he wrote on that topic. Another way that Jupiter is emphasized here is that the moon is applying to Jupiter. So the moon's next aspect is actually to Jupiter during Jupiter hour. And we also see that Jupiter is in a degree-based trine with the ascendant. So there are all of these ways in which the magnanimity and the support and the beneficence of Jupiter are emphasized in this election. So in general, Jupiter has to do with religious matters, with matters of belief, faith, but also faith in the sense of camaraderie, faith in the sense of believing that we are in this together, and that there's something that binds us beyond our purported beliefs or beyond our ideologies, but that there is something greater that unites us. Jupiter's power in Pisces, there are many of them, but one of them is to inspire this sense of good faith, to hold each other in good faith, and to believe in each other, to believe that at the end, we will always end up doing what is right for each other. And this is a belief. This is not something that always bears out in practice. In fact, it rarely does. But is there a way in which holding that vision, holding that truth, or holding a belief in that truth can bring about positive ends? Is there a way in which this can lead us to something closer to that vision? Ideals are never fully manifested. Ideals take time to implement. And when we implement them, they are no longer ideals. They are practice. We could say they are Saturn once they are manifested concretely. And so when we're looking at Jupiter, we're thinking about things that are in the mind or in principle, but not necessarily actionable or realizable. And so what Jupiter in this position can do is to give us the ideal that inspires action, even if the action itself is never able to fully manifest those ideals, because that is simply the nature of ideals themselves. But it still helps to have ideals, right? Jupiter in this chart is an influence that can keep us going and keep us inspired with whatever it is that we're doing in the 11th house. Because the ruler of the ascendant, again, is in the 11th sign, we're concerned with matters of community. And so if you're in a community where you want a greater sense of good faith, this is an excellent election to implement that or mobilize your community to that end. Our next election is for Thursday, January 13th. And this election actually breaks some of my favorite rules in electional astrology in order to fulfill some other criteria that I think are really interesting and important. So the rule that is being broken here with this Gemini rising chart is that Mercury, who is at basically a standstill, is the ruler of the ascendant. And so when the ruler of the ascendant is a stationary planet, we're dealing with immobility, or in Mercury's case, the mind being kind of stuck, or the mind digging deep into one thing rather than being able to extend to many issues. When Mercury, just by its very nature as the fleet-footed messenger, it's about delivering things quickly. But here we have a Mercury that is very slow. And so whatever messages are being delivered or whatever communication is being done, there's something slow, something maybe a little bit unclear. We have Saturn here with Mercury, and Saturn is a planet that has both to do with lack of clarity. Saturn blocks and obstructs light. It's very dim. And in addition to that, it is slow. It is the slowest visible planet. And so when we have this Mercury conjunct Saturn, it looks a lot like messages that are slow, communication that is slow. A positive spin on slow is deliberate. So what is being deliberated upon here? What communication is being made with an authority figure, perhaps? And when you're talking to somebody who's an authority figure or somebody who you deeply respect, you're very careful with your words. And so this election is one where taking care with your words is very much emphasized. And so if there's communication that you need to do that requires that kind of precision and attention to detail with your language, this is a good one for that. This is a very relationship-oriented chart. And I think it's actually quite successful potentially for relationships, even though Mars is in the 7th house of partners, or the other partner, the other party of the election. Mars being the planet of conflict, usually when we see Mars in the 7th house, it's not a great chart for elections that involve dealing directly one-on-one with other people. But in this case, I'm going to make an exception, and I'll tell you why. It has to do with the condition of Jupiter, which is the ruler of the 7th house. And it has to do with the way that the moon is connecting Mercury and Jupiter. So if you just look at Mercury and Jupiter on their own, they're not communicating with each other. They are in signs that are next to each other. And so what we say in astrology is that these planets are averse. In other words, they don't make an aspect with each other. They don't make a classical aspect with each other. And so they can't see each other, or they don't have a way to communicate, it seems. But in this specific chart, there's this very unique moment that happens when the moon moves from an aspect with Jupiter directly into an aspect with Mercury. So we can see this in the chart where the moon, its most recent aspect was a square with Jupiter in Pisces, and its next aspect is going to be a trine with Mercury, and Mercury is the ruler of the moon. And so because the moon is making this connection from Jupiter to Mercury, it's as if a message is being delivered or resources are being exchanged between Mercury and Jupiter. This is what the moon does. The moon translates light. It is the fastest thing in the sky. And so when it connects with one planet, it is said to take the light of that planet and carry it with it into its next aspect. And so in this chart, that transference is being made from Jupiter to Mercury. And Jupiter is the planet that signifies the seventh house of the other party. And so what the moon is doing here, then, it's taking something, it's delivering some message, some resource from the other party, and it's bringing it to the ascendant ruler, this Mercury in Aquarius. Additionally, the moon is the ruler of the second house. So this could certainly be some kind of financial exchange, or an exchange of property of some kind, especially movable property. In other words, like not land, not a house, but something that is like an object or money. Additionally, with the moon being in the first house, the moon is the planet of reception. It's the planet of receiving, right? It reflects the moon, the light of the sun. And so with the moon being in the first house, this is a sign that the first house, or the person initiating the action, is receiving something. And so if you need to ask for something, if you need to ask for a favor, or you need to ask for money, this is a good chart for that. Now, I do want to not forget that Mars is in the seventh house. And so there might be a sense of conflict or a sense of heatedness around the ask. But ultimately, because the ruler of the ascendant is so benefic, and because it's that Jupiter is ruling sort of like the end of whatever is going on here. It's ruling the ultimate effect. So maybe, for example, you ask for money or you ask for something from somebody, and they are initially quite angry or tiffed about it in some way, but at the end of the day, they ultimately agree to it. So don't be discouraged just because the initial feedback is negative or malefic in some way, or if there's discomfort in the exchange, because at the end of the day, Jupiter is gonna, rain down goodness upon you. So if anybody uses this election for something, definitely comment and let me know what happens. Okay, on to Friday, January 14th. Friday is a day where I literally cannot find an election that has really anything going for it. And the reason for this is because the moon is opposing Mars, and also the ruler of the moon is retrograde. And so back to what we talked about earlier, when the moon was in Taurus and Venus is retrograde, same idea applies here, where the ruler of the moon's debilitation is really problematic for the election as a whole. And in addition to that, the moon is being afflicted by Mars. And so anything on Friday is just a little bit, I really can't recommend any charts from Friday. And that's usually pretty rare, but it does go to show this idea that when the moon is struggling, whether because its ruler is struggling or because it's making difficult aspects, that those are days when you really want to keep it low key, or usually you want to avoid making any major decisions or taking major actions on that day. So if you have a choice, for example, between doing something on Thursday or doing it on Friday, definitely do it on Thursday, because that's when the moon is going to be, less trouble, then it's actually going to have quite a bit of help from Jupiter at that point. So our election for Saturday, January 15th, is similar to some of the ones we had earlier in the week, where we have a Cancer rising, except this time, instead of the moon in Taurus, we have the moon in Cancer in its own sign. And so this is going to be another election where it has to do with receiving something, potentially asking for something from a benevolent other. With the moon in Cancer, it can also be a really nice time for doing something around your house, or asking for help around the house, or somehow improving your domestic situation. We do see that the moon is also in a trine with Jupiter, and Jupiter is quite close to the midheaven. So what this says is that that the person undertaking the action is in a harmonious relationship with an authority figure, particularly somebody of a Jupiterian nature, somebody who's abundant, giving, generous, things like this, Jupiterian qualities. This moon in Cancer can also help deliver domestic improvements. I often find that with the moon in Cancer, there's an ability to improve domestic situations, even if the moon is not in your natal chart connected to domestic matters. Something about the moon's transit in Cancer is helpful for improving a living situation, whether it's through securing housing or through rearranging furniture or otherwise improving your domestic life. So, especially if this has to do with parents, like if you're somebody who lives with your parents, or you're somebody who might live with your parents for a little bit, or you need to ask to do that, this is like a good chart for doing that. And it shows that because of this trine with Jupiter, that there's like a lot of support for making some kind of improvement, even if it's something that has to happen quickly. So with this Cancer moon being in the rising sign, we're looking at a lot of cardinal energy, which means starting things, right? And so when the moon is in a cardinal sign, and when the rising sign is in a cardinal sign, we're looking at things that can turn on a dime. It's like, I need this to happen quickly. I need an immediate result. And so because of that, this chart would be really good if you need to make sudden improvements to your living situation, or you need to suddenly find housing. Maybe you didn't expect that you would have to, but now all of a sudden you do. So this is a really good chart for that. It's also in the middle of the month, so I don't know if anybody has like January leases coming up or something. But I remember, yeah, I signed the lease for my current place when it was like actually a really bad election. So we don't always find great charts, but this is a pretty good one for if you had to like sign a lease or something like that. Okay, on to Sunday, January 16th. So with this chart, we're looking at something that's very similar to the previous chart. It's the same rising sign. It's just that the moon has moved forward a little bit. Everything else has stayed pretty much the same. And so what this election does is it moves the emphasis away from Jupiter, and it moves it toward Venus, because the moon's aspect is no longer this trine with Jupiter, but instead it's an opposition with Venus. And, a lot of people don't like oppositions. A lot of people try to stay away from oppositions, even to benefics. I don't, as a rule. Like, I think that oppositions to benefics are just fine. The thing is that this particular benefic is retrograde. And so there's a sense of something being withheld, something not being available, right? So if we look at this ascendant ruler, this moon, as the individual themselves and like their efforts and their motivation, then we look across the wheel at this Venus retrograde in the 7th, and this makes it seem as if there is something that's being asked for, certainly, and something that could be offered, but they're a little bit hesitant or reticent to do so because Venus is so slow. It's getting ready to station direct, and it's barely moving. However, this could be something where maybe you need to revise a contract, particularly regarding property, maybe even marriage. Like, I know some people get post-nuptial agreements. This could be effective specifically for renegotiating things. So not starting a marriage or not starting some kind of new relationship, but for contractually renegotiating something. And during Venus retrogrades, that is in general a pretty important time for renegotiating any number of things within relationships, even if it's just your dynamic. Like maybe you need to have a conversation about like, what are we doing here? Or like, I don't feel seen in this or that way, or like, I need this from you. And if you were to have some kind of conversation like that on this election, I would expect the person to be maybe a little bit not sure how to respond because of this slowness of Venus. It's really pointing to something that hasn't been fully worked out yet for this other person. Like they're really not sure. And we do see that, there's this Mercury retrograde in the 8th house again, conjunct the ruler of the 7th. And so there might be, issues of resources or shared resources that are involved here. And with Saturn being in its own sign there, it shows that this other person, that they have a good sense of what is valuable, and that at the end of the day, they're going to be supportive of what it is that you need, if you let them know in a way that they can understand. So with the moon having no aspect to Saturn in Aquarius, they are averse, this can show that there's maybe a lack of understanding, especially at first, between the moon and Saturn, because they don't really see eye to eye on whatever is going here. So it could just be that more communication or more conversations are needed in order to work this out. But it is something where you can certainly state your needs or be very clear with yourself about your needs, which is a very important first step for ultimately the other person witnessing that as well. Okay, and the last chart of the week, we have Monday, January 17th. This is at Pisces rising, basically. We just stick Jupiter on the ascendant and we pray. There's nothing wrong with January 17th as a transit per se, but from an electional perspective, we do generally avoid full moons for elections. There are certain applications of full moons that you might be interested in, like if you're somebody who, I don't know, makes moon water or something like that, maybe you'll use a full moon. But for most electional things, we don't do that, or we try to avoid full moons in general because it can be a little bit overwhelming. Like the energy of a full moon is at such a peak intensity that we don't necessarily want to take peak intensity with us everywhere we go. So if this whole idea of electional astrology is that we start something and then the energy of the moment at which we started it comes with us. We don't always want peak intensity all the time. We usually want something a little bit more moderate or a little bit easier to hold. You can think about the full moon, it's this peak light. We can also think of it as peak heat. And things that are hot can be a little bit unwieldy, a little bit difficult to hold on to and to continue to hold on to. We might drop them because of that heat, right? So with the moon being full on the 17th, certainly a lot of important things could happen, and you could just see a lot of threads get tied together in your life, because that's what a full moon transit does. It brings things to completion. But it's not necessarily the moment for starting a new thing because of this issue of overwhelm. So in this election, what I've done is I've put the moon and the sun in benefic places. So they're in the 5th and the 11th sign. Cancer and Capricorn are 5th and 11th from the rising sign of Pisces, respectively. And so rather than saying like, okay, let's put the sun on the ascendant and the moon on the descendant, or like really emphasizing the sun and the moon, let's put the sun and the moon in places that have to do with gain. The 5th house of good fortune, speculation, gambling, children, fun, things that are enjoyable. Let's put this full moon in a place that has to do with pleasure and joy. And let's put the sun in a place that has to do with community and gain. So that's what I've done here. And then putting the Pisces Jupiter on the ascendant, it just helps lift the spirit, right? Like approaching this election with happiness is very important. That's actually important for all elections, is to come at this election with a lifted spirit and to treasure the chart. And this is a chart where I think that will be easier to do than many others. Specifically, I would recommend this election just as a general purpose election, maybe avoiding it for things that have to do with career or making big announcements, because we do have this Mars that's in the 10th house of career and reputation. And it's actually getting very close to the MC, which is like, the cusp of the 10th house. It's the most prominent point in the chart, arguably, maybe other than the ascendant. So Mars being so emphasized like that could show conflict being central, especially if you do it around a career matter or doing something that has there's a lot at stake for your reputation. So maybe avoiding that, using it for something that's like more personal, more low key, more private perhaps. And we do see this Mercury-Saturn conjunction in the 12th house, which is certainly very private. So maybe this is a more personal election where you're thinking some things through, or you're journaling, or you're doing like a voice memo where you just sort of, let it all fly loose and you see what comes out. And so that does it for Elections Weekly. I will be doing these every week. That is my Venus retrograde and my third house commitment to you, is that I'll be doing weekly videos, basically doing just this. And let me know if you use any of these elections and if you have any feedback about them and what happens for you. So one last thing is that I do want to make it very clear that you don't have to like change the time zone or something with these charts. You just do the time that I'm showing for your location, and then you adjust it minute by minute to get it to look like exactly what I'm showing. So with that, hopefully you have everything you need to use some of these elections, to align your actions with them, and hopefully have some good things happen. So thanks for joining me on this episode, and I'll see you next week.